So we were looking into chapter 2, unit 1. So now we look at part 2 of the video, which is after this difference between agreement and contract. So what are the essentials of a valid contract? So for a contract to be valid, there has to be an agreement, and then there has to be free consent. So what do you mean by agreement? So yesterday we saw about agreement and contract. So what do you mean by agreement? Agreement is nothing but when a party makes an offer or proposal plus when another party accepts the same for a consideration. So that's what we call as an agreement. Offer or proposal plus acceptance plus consideration. Now what is offer or proposal plus acceptance? So that's called as a promise. So agreement is basically a promise plus consideration, and this agreement can be of two types. One is social agreement, which is not legally enforceable, which is not covered by the Contract Act, and there are other types of contracts which has legal enforceability. So those contracts that has legal enforceability will be referred to as contract. So contract is basically an agreement which is legally enforceable. So that is agreement plus legal enforceability. Agreement plus legal enforceability. So there has to be an agreement and there has to be free consent, and there must be at least two parties. A person cannot enter into a contract with himself. So there has to be at least two parties, and there must be some intention to create legal relationships. The legal relationship meaning there has to be legal enforceability. Agreement and legal enforceability for it to be a contract. And there has to be free consent, which we will see in detail later on. And competency of parties. Parties must be competent to contract, and they will have to fulfill all the legal formalities. There should be lawful consideration, legal object, and it should not be expressly declared as void. So now if we go to see what are the essentials of a valid contract, which can be divided into two categories. One is those which are required under section 10 of Indian Contract Act, and the other category being which is not required by the act per se, that is by section 10, but again these are also essential elements. Now what are those elements or essentials which are required by the act? One is agreement, free consent, competency of parties, lawful consideration, legal object, and not expressly declared to be void. So which we will look into detail in the upcoming pages. And the ones which are not given by section 10 but are also essential, which includes two parties. There must be two parties, there has to be legal relationship, they have to fulfill all the legal formalities, there has to be certainty of meaning and possibility of performance. Now first we will see those that are not required by section 10 but are also considered essential, so which includes two parties. So obviously we know that there has to be two parties. One should make the offer and other should accept it. So these can be done by contract, and these contracts can be done by individuals or by entities like companies or universities, and their identities must be ascertainable. We should be able to identify the person or maybe the entity, that like company or university with whom the contract has been entered into. Example, State of Gujarat versus Ramanlal S & Co. It was determined that partners cannot be both buyers and sellers of the joint assets, because we know that as a matter of fact we know that in a firm, unlike company, partners and firm are one and the same. So in this case, if at all the firm is selling the assets and if the partners are buying the same, then it cannot be a contract, because anyways firm and partners are one and the same. If firm is selling the assets and it is shared between the joint partners, wherein the joint partners are buying the same, right? So in which case, if the firm is a seller and the joint partners are buyers, in that case they are one and the same. So this cannot be a contract, because contract has to be between two persons. Like for example, A and B, A is selling goods to B worth 50,000. Now this is a valid contract because these are two different parties, A and B, whereas in this case firm and partners are one and the same. So it cannot be a contract, and there has to be an intention to create legal obligation. Now there must be some intention to create legal obligation. Like what do you mean by that? Legal obligation, legal relationship. social or domestic agreements, they are not contracts. They're not enforceable in the court of law. Like for example, in yesterday's example, we saw there was a contract between Mr. A and Mr. A's father. In case if he clears the CA exam, then in that case his father said that he will be paying 50,000 to his son, which is again a social agreement. It is not an agreement which is legally enforceable. Legally enforceable meaning in case if they don't comply with the terms and conditions of the contract, then in that case you will be able to file a suit. That is a case in the court of law, no, which is not possible in case of social or domestic agreements. Formalities are that contracts can be written or oral. Both are legally valid, but which one is more reliable? Written or more reliable? It's preferred for clarity. Certain contracts like insurance, but again it can be written or oral. Both are valid, but written is any day preferred as compared to oral. But again, in certain types of contracts, written agreement is mandatory. Like for example, registration. Like if at all you get a land registered in your name, it has to be in written format. It cannot be oral, right? So it has to be in written format. And like insurance agreements, it has to be a written agreement, or those agreements involving immovable property, which is again this registration. Certainty of meaning. The agreement should be clear and not vague or indefinite. If it is uncertain, it cannot be enforced. It's not legally enforceable. Like what do they mean by certainty of meaning? Like for example, A and B enter into a contract wherein the A is selling oil to B. Now this is a contract between A and B. A is selling oil to B worth 1 lakh. So now they have not mentioned what kind of oil this is. This can be coconut oil, this can be olive oil, this can be sunflower oil, it can be any type of oil, right? So what about the certainty of meaning? Here meaning is not certain. Whatever the terms of contract that they are entering into is not certain, in which case this is vague or indefinite, so this cannot be enforced. Then next is possibility of performance. If you enter into a contract, the terms must be such that it's capable of being performed. If at all you enter into an agreement wherein it's specifying some impossible act, then it's unenforceable. Like for example, A enters into a contract with B stating that we will do magic and find treasure. Now this is an impossible act, so hence it's unenforceable. Or if at all A and B enter into an agreement stating that if sun rises in the west, I will pay you so and so amount, in which case again it's unenforceable because it's not possible of being performed in the first case. In the first place it cannot be performed, so again this is not a valid contract. So for a contract to be valid, what are the essentials which are not required as per act but still essential? Right, first thing is two parties. There must be two parties. There must be some intention to create legal obligation. All the formalities will have to be fulfilled. Meaning has to be certain and it must be possible of being performed. And next is what are the essential elements of valid contract? No, this is as per Indian Contract Act. What are the essential elements of valid contract? So what are the essential elements? One is offer and acceptance. There must be some offer from one person and the other party will have to accept the same. Offer plus acceptance becomes a promise. When it's done for a consideration, it becomes an agreement. So there has to be offer plus acceptance plus consideration for it to be an agreement. First it has to be an agreement and then it has to be legally enforceable so that it can be a contract. So there has to be offer and acceptance. When one party makes an offer or proposal, another party accepts it. So every promise and every set of promise forming consideration for each other, that's called an agreement. When a proposal is accepted, then it becomes a promise. Right, every promise and set of promise forming consideration is an agreement. What do they mean by this? See, promise is nothing but offer a proposal plus acceptance is promise. And this promise plus consideration becomes an agreement. Now that's what they're exactly referring to. Every promise and every set of promise plus consideration becomes an agreement. And when a proposal is accepted, it becomes a promise. Proposal plus acceptance equal to promise. Promise plus consideration equal to agreement. Agreement, when it's legally enforceable, becomes a contract. And next, free consent. Consent meaning, what do you mean by consent? Consent means approval. When one person is making an offer, another one is approving or agreeing to the same, then it becomes... Then it's said that the other party is giving us consent. For example, A is selling this car to B and B accepts the same. All the terms, car, the money and everything. So in that case, it becomes a fact that it becomes a promise. So here B is giving his consent to A, that he is consenting to buy that car. So consent, when it's said to be free consent meaning it has to be voluntary and it should not be forced or coerced. So when it's not affected by, when the consent is not free, when it's caused by coercion or undue influence, fraud or misrepresentation or mistake. Coercion, what do you mean by coerce? Coerce meaning to force or threaten a person and asking and then making them agree. When it's done by undue influence when there are two persons and if one can influence other person through the authority or power and is making them agree, in that case there is no free consent, there is no voluntary approval or consent. And when it's caused by fraud, by concealing the facts or misrepresentation, by the facts which are again mistaken, in that case fraud is intentional. Only difference being fraud is intentional. So intentionally you're telling something, wrong facts, and then you're forcing the other person to agree, or maybe you're fraudulently trying other person to manipulate and making them agree. Misrepresentation is also like false facts, getting the approval through false facts, but again this is done unintentionally or by mistake. Mistake is basically an error. So consensus addendum meaning there has to be similarity of mind and they will have to agree in the same sense. That is, there must be mutual understanding of the terms. Only then there is said to be free consent. Capacity of parties. There has to be similarity of minds. That is, for example, if A is selling his car to B, A is making an offer that he's selling his white car for 5 lakh and B accepts the same. So A is thinking in his mind that it's white car, whereas B is thinking that it's red car and is agreeing to the same. In this case, it's not valid because there is no similarity of mind in this case. No similarity of mind, so in this case, it's not a valid contract. So capacity of parties. Parties must be having legal ability to enter into contract. What do you mean by legal ability? So first thing being, for a party to be able to enter into contract, they must be at least 18 years and they must be of sound mind and should not be disqualified. Minors, lunatics and intoxicated persons are disqualified. Now this is again very important. So who are competent to enter into a contract? So basically